Hi, welcome back. I'm Dr. Emily Helder, adoption researcher, clinical psychologist. I'm here with two of my students, Francie and Ava Schneider, and we're continuing to talk about the Stauffer case. Last time we talked a bit about kind of adoption preparation and how to get ready for adoption. And in this episode, we'll talk about how there might have been some misunderstanding and misinterpretation of Huxley's behavior. So in order to give maybe people who aren't as familiar, with some of the context, what kinds of behaviors in particular, were the Stauffers talking about as problematic?
Yeah, so in their YouTube videos, they kind of explained that a big part of the reason why they went through with this adoption dissolution was because of Huxley's behaviors. And Micah specifically mentioned some of these behaviors as reasons why she felt that this was the best thing to do for Huxley. She explained, "We saw that in his family time with other people, he constantly chose them and signed and showed tons of emotion to show us and let us know he wanted this." And then she also said, Huxley wanted this decision 100%. And I think that's sparked a lot of controversy, especially because, for one, his age and a lot of other factors that are going on. So as a professional in the field, what is your initial reaction to these kinds of statements? And do you disagree or agree with the interpretation?
Yeah, for a variety of reasons, I disagree, or I think there's some problems. From just a child development perspective, kids at 4 or 5 years old really don't have the cognitive capacity to make that kind of long-term decision about who they want to be, as their parents, right? Even like in custody cases, we don't let a 4 or 5-year-old, choose who they want to live with. Their opinions are part of it in those custody evals, but they're not the ones making the decision. The other piece is that I worry that some of what she was describing is actually not Huxley communicating that he wants to be, living in that other family, but actually something that we call disinhibited social behavior. So this was first described among kids who are adopted from orphanage care or institutions. At first it was called indiscriminate friendliness, but now it's called disinhibited social behavior. It's this idea where kids adopted from these settings, especially initially, often are overly friendly with strangers. So they don't always show that same level of like reticence around people that they don't know very well. So they might hop right up in the lap of a stranger or grab the hand of a stranger or ask them very personal questions, if they're verbal. So there's not as much this distinction between this is my parent and they're my special people, and then these are people who I don't know very well, and so I have these boundaries up with them. And it's actually super common. So about 20% or so of kids adopted from institutions show this initially. And research shows it's actually fairly persistent too. So it tends to last over time. What I always tell families and what I think is really important to convey is that this disinhibited social behavior is separate from attachment to the adoptive parent. So at least when we first were talking about this behavior pattern, there were some that said that when kids showed this indiscriminate friendliness, that was a sign that they weren't securely attached to their caregiver. But follow-up research shows that it's actually not correlated with attachment, that a kid can be very securely attached to their adoptive parent and still show this kind of disinhibited social behavior. So all that to say, those two things are separate things, but I worry that the Stauffers didn't, that maybe that's what was going on, and they really didn't understand that behavior wasn't a reflection on his attachment to them or his desire to live with that family, but was really a behavioral response to the institutional care. And this is another example of a behavior that's actually adaptive in institutions, but maybe not so much in a family setting. Because if you think about it, in an orphanage, in an institution, caregivers rotate usually pretty frequently. And so the kids that get the most attention are the ones that can easily run up to, engage with, interact with a new caregiver when anybody shows up. Those are the ones that get the resources that they need, the most care. The kids that are picky about who takes care of them don't do so well in institutions. And so that kind of behavioral pattern is actually pretty adaptive in an institution. It's just not as much in a family setting.
Mm-hmm. How can indiscriminate friendliness or disinhibited social behavior kind of be mitigated over time? And is that possible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the research does show it is fairly persistent, like more persistent than some of the other behaviors that you see. Mm-hmm. Like we talked about eating behaviors in a past video. Those tend to improve with time, whereas the indiscriminate friendliness tends to persist a little bit more. But it is definitely something that families can address if it becomes problematic. Usually I recommend some very explicit instruction and kind of in the moment coaching with the kid. So just having some discussions about, this is someone we don't know very well, and so we don't touch them or get in their lap. We're your special people and we can do those things with you, but that's not something that we do with strangers. And then in the moment, then when you're interacting with a stranger and you maybe see the child start to do those things, you can have that little cue or that reminder. So really, this disinhibited social behavior is primarily an inhibition or an impulse control issue. And so addressing the impulse control or inhibition aspect of it is really what's going to make it get better.
So in addition to indiscriminate friendliness, there is something called institutional quasi-autistic behavior. Mm-hmm. And apparently it's found in profoundly deprived children. Is this relevant to the Stauffer situation at all?
Yeah, I'm not, not having done an assessment of Huxley, hard to say, but this was first described by the English Romanian adoptees study. So in UK, they followed, starting in the 90s, followed a number of children who were adopted from Romanian orphanages into the UK and looked at what kinds of things those kids were experiencing. And in about 6% of kids, so, this is a small subset, they were showing these, what they called quasi-autistic behaviors. So symptoms of autism like stereotyped motor movements and social language challenges, but it didn't follow all the patterns of autism. So typically autism has a higher incidence in boys than girls, but among kids adopted from these Romanian orphanages, the gender distribution was equal, right? So that's why they called it quasi-autism, because there were aspects of it that looked a little bit different. So yeah, I have, in the Stauffer videos, they talk about Huxley experiencing symptoms of autism, but it's hard for me to say whether that, fits the same pattern of quasi-autism or whether it's kind of more typically the symptoms that we would expect in kind of garden variety autism.
I know that trauma and deprivation can have a pretty big effect on a child, and that it can actually change the biology, and it really can affect a child throughout their entire lifespan. Mm-hmm. And Huxley was adopted at 2.5 years old, so it's hard for him to have any explicit memory of the trauma that he experienced during his first couple of years. So how long do you think that the effects of the trauma he may have experienced will persist throughout his life? And do you think that there will be a time that he ever remembers them, or that just sort of the effects will stick with him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are really good questions. It's helpful to make this distinction between explicit memory and implicit memory. So explicit memory is that, memories we can consciously recall, talk about the details of, etc. For most kids we start to have some of those earlier explicit memories at around 4 or 5 years old, because that's when the structures that are involved in explicit memory, reach a more mature level. But we also have these implicit memories, which are ones that are unconsciously formed. We make these as adults, but a lot of our earlier memories from before 5 are stored implicitly. So I wouldn't necessarily expect that he would always remember details like consciously, but implicit memories have a strong impact on our interactions with other people and our emotion regulation, our behavior regulation. They set up patterns for how we relate to other people, what we expect out of relationships, those kind of things. So that's why the attachment relationship that's formed so early, it's really an implicit memory that impacts kind of later functioning. So I guess with trauma, trauma has a lifelong effect, but it affects people differently. So it's hard to predict for any one person what it's going to be. When people have things that might buffer their stress levels, or when they engage in interventions to try to process trauma that they've experienced, maybe they have even genetic resilience that predicts their outcomes, right? So there's a whole host of factors that relate to outcomes, but I really want people to understand that it's important to think of trauma over the lifespan. And sometimes too, from the research, we find that trauma that people experience in early life, you might not notice effects of it initially in early childhood, for example, but that there can be what we call sleeper effects, where, say, in adolescence or in adulthood, there are things that can be tied back to that original trauma.
Why might it not appear kind of in early childhood as opposed to like in the later years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it somewhat depends on what kind of skills you're looking at. So like for impulse control or attention, those are two common areas that are impacted by early deprivation, early neglect, early abuse. But when you're a preschooler, we have pretty low expectations for impulse control and attention for preschoolers. Like, we just know they can't sit still for too long. But really, it's not until kids age into, later elementary school where we're starting to have stronger expectations for what they're going to be able to do. And so you wouldn't see challenges emerge until those expectations go higher. But, that's the same for social functioning too, right? In childhood, the social interactions are pretty structured. Parents organize them, parents are supervising them, and it's really not until adolescence where some of that, becomes more on the teen to be organizing and initiating. So hopefully this was helpful kind of in thinking about how the Stauffers, were interpreting Huxley's behavior and ways that relates to some adoption research, especially with disinhibited social behavior. So next we'll be talking a bit about parenting biological kids versus adopted kids and the experiences of bio versus adopted kids and how that might relate to the case. Thanks.